Left-wing authoritarianism has infiltrated our universities and made significant headway in the mental health field, seizing control of many training programs, institutes, and several national mental health organizations. In August of 2021, Thomas Costello and 5 of his colleagues at Emory University published an article entitled "Clarifying the Nature and Structure of Left-Wing Authoritarianism." This article caused quite a stir among social and political psychologists because, until recently, social scientists generally assume that left-wingers are fundamentally anti-authoritarian, and that left-wing authoritarianism is either rare or actually non-existent. Bob Altemeyer, who is a leading figure in this field of research, described left-wing authoritarianism as, and I quote, "the Loch Ness monster of political psychology, an occasional shadow but no monster." And that the tacit implication of this remark is that left-wing authoritarianism is a kind of a rumor with no substance behind it. Altemeyer's claim seems absurd on the face of it. Never mind what's going on right now. Just consider the 20th century, which was riddled with self-proclaimed liberators turned brutal dictators who spouted left-wing ideology. Altemeyer responded to this criticism by saying that he administered the right-wing authoritarianism scale to hundreds of Stalinists and found that they were no different fundamentally than their right-wing counterparts. An interesting observation. But then he also classified left-wing dictators as wild-card authoritarians, which appears to imply that they're not really left-wing, but political opportunists of one sort or another, and undoubtedly some were. But by contrast with Altemeyer, Thomas Costello and his colleagues at Emory maintained that Altemeyer found no evidence of left-wing authoritarianism for at least 4 decades of research because he administered his right-wing authoritarianism scale to self-identified left-wingers rather than constructing new scales that are designed specifically to measure left-wing authoritarianism. When asked why left-wing authoritarianism has been all but invisible till now, at least to the social scientists whose job it is to study it, Costello traced the problem back to Theodor Adorno's landmark study, The Authoritarian Personality, which was published in 1950, and which depicted authoritarianism as a constellation of traits found among political conservatives. And Adorno had his critics on this score, of course, and did not take kindly to their critiques. Still, the fact that Adorno, Altemeyer, and most researchers in the authoritarianism field focus narrowly on right-wing authoritarianism is not to dismiss their findings out of hand. On the contrary, as January 6th demonstrates, right-wing authoritarianism poses a grave and immediate threat to democracy, and we have mountains of but we have mountains of data on the psychology of right-wing authoritarians. By contrast, left-wing authoritarianism has never been scrutinized that closely, giving us very little data to work with. But there is now an urgent need for this research because left-wing authoritarianism has infiltrated our universities and made significant headway in the mental health field, seizing control of many training programs, institutes, and several national mental health organizations. So the following statements are empirical generalizations, meaning that they're true more often than not, and these will serve as a guide for future research, I hope. One trait that right and left-wing authoritarians share is a tendency towards what the psychologist Milton Rokia called dichotomous thinking, reflected, among other things, in a tendency to divide humankind into separate groups whose rights and interests they claim are inalterably opposed. Right-wing authoritarians, for example, divide people into binary categories like the strong versus the weak, the winners versus the losers, the superior versus the inferior, and the pure versus the impure. By contrast, their left-wing counterparts bifurcate humanity into groups like the oppressors and the oppressed, imperialists and anti-imperialists, the bad and the good, whites and people of color. Even when they think they do so with the best intentions, people who think in these blinkered dualistic terms often lose the ability to grasp what is going on in the world in a deeper, more complex and nuanced way. And this prompts them to develop or to adhere to policies that can be harmful and discriminatory. Another trait that right and left-wing authoritarians share is dogmatism. Dogmatism refers to the fervent embrace of claims, statements, and beliefs that are either demonstrably false or at least open to reasonable doubt, but are nonetheless embraced by large numbers of people. Among those who share dogmatic beliefs, those who do not share them, the heretics, the contrarians, the dissenters, they're usually viewed as ethically or intellectually deficient. And among extremely dogmatic authoritarians, people who actually challenge their beliefs publicly are deemed to be depraved or dangerous to society and targeted for reprisals of one sort or another. Consider the case of Kathleen Stock, formerly a professor of philosophy at the University of Sussex. In a 2021 book entitled Material Girls: Why Reality Matters to Feminism, Stock asserted that gender roles and identities are indeed socially constructed, but that biological sex is nonetheless quite real and rooted in our species' evolutionary history. Stock never impugned or denied the rights of trans men and women to alter their bodies, to insist on their preferred personal pronouns, and above all, to live free from discrimination and fear. Nevertheless, despite her emphatic clarity on this point, her position was parodied, distorted, and quoted out of context. Hateful ideas and utterances were knowingly misattributed to her, and she was targeted as a trans-exclusionary radical feminist, or a TERF. Now, the university administration at Sussex was cowered in the shadows and only came to her defense after she'd endured 2.5 years of steady harassment. Too late. She resigned after 12 years of teaching. Now, Stock's case raises several questions. One is, of course, is whether what she says regarding sex is true. I happen to believe that it is, but the other, more urgent question from my standpoint pertains to the issue of academic freedom. In short, whether Professor Stock was entitled to voice her opinions without fear of reprisal and without being subjected to years of slander, harassment, and multiple death threats directed at her, her wife, and her child from an angry mob that was determined to shame, exclude, and ruin her. Sadly, Stock's case is not an isolated incident. Today's academic activists and their students often form groups that seek to destroy the reputations and the livelihoods of those who disagree with them. This is a vivid illustration of the trait of dogmatism that I've been talking about. But whereas right-wing authoritarians, who can be equally dogmatic in different ways, but with the same intensity, right-wing authoritarians, they tend to value racial or religious purity historically. By contrast with right-wing authoritarians, left-wing authoritarians insist on ideological purity.